Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing investigative reporter TJ Martinell's work at the forefront of the Secretary of State debate, a county official shooting down a budget measure for what he called ill-advised spending, and the federal and state government still trying to wrap their heads around this whole cannabis thing. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. The candidates vying for Washington Secretary of State met this week, presenting stark contrasts as to how each would fulfill the duties of the office. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson covered the panel discussion. This was a punch-out, or did it more resemble the debate that was going on at the same time, Carlene?
I wonder if anybody was watching, right? Because the debate on Tuesday night started at 7 local time, and the VP debate was still going on, which had started at 6. So I don't know how many people were watching. I was kind of watching both, but it was very interesting and tense at times between incumbent Secretary of State Steve Hobbs and his challenger, Dale Whitaker. So right off the bat, Whitaker went after Hobbs over removing the 30-day residency requirement to vote. And that's something that my colleague TJ Martinell was first to report on earlier this year. Obviously still a big story.
Right. And flesh that out a little bit in terms of what TJ found in the clandestine nature behind it. Because if we did not publish that story, it's very likely that could have never even become news, and Mr. Whitaker might not have had that to talk about.
Right. So Hobbs' office, Hobbs is the incumbent. He basically just through agency rulemaking, removed the 30-day residency requirement, even though it's in our state constitution, and it has been from day one, basically saying a person has to be a resident of Washington and in their community for 30 days immediately preceding the election in which they're going to vote on. But Hobbs and State Attorney General Bob Ferguson basically settled on a behind the scenes, if you will, consent decree to settle a lawsuit that had been filed in 2023 that was brought by the Alliance for Retired Americans, I believe. They argued that the constitutional provision violated federal law, but that was going to be for voting on federal elections, like presidential elections, not state law. And that was the problem. And the argument that was brought up repeatedly by Mr. Whitaker during the debate was, okay, the whole idea is you want people to be voting on issues, state and local issues in their community. You don't want somebody, say, from Pierce County voting in King County elections and vice versa.
Yeah.
You don't want local school board and fire district levies decided by somebody who doesn't live in your community. They shouldn't have a say in your tax decisions, right? So that opened up the possibility of that. But Hobbs fired back. He says it's voter suppression if you, keep the 30-day residency requirement. He says just because somebody's new to a community, they have every right to have a voice in their community. And so he still stands by same-day registration, same-day voting, says that's all about access to the ballot box.
And what Whitaker had brought up was the hypothetical of, say, if I live in downtown Seattle, I'm in what the Cook political index, which is the R+10, D+20 type metrics. If I live in Congresswoman, in a Democrat +30 district, but I want my vote to matter more, without this 30-day residency requirement, I could, in theory, and me and maybe a couple thousand of my friends all move into a district that is a toss-up, which you are, in Washington, you've got a couple at the congressional or state level. And I could establish residency. I could say, here's my address. I live here in this swing district. And I could be then given a local, not just federal, because that's the Voting Rights Act. That's a pretty cut and dry issue that's been settled nationwide, where it's been brought up before. But states are, at this point, to my understanding, from what I've seen elsewhere as well, able to establish things like a 30-day residency requirement and other, like, for instance, in Arizona, they have, if you want to get something that's not a federal-only ballot, you must prove you are a legal United States citizen. They are the only ones in the country that require such a thing. But in this, you could hypothetically say, I am now a resident of Pullman, and I have an address here, and I am swearing that I am a resident here, and get a full state ballot affecting local races in a place where you are not a resident. And that is...
huge
Hobbs discounted. Well, Hobbs discounted that, saying this is an issue of allowing people to exercise their civic responsibilities in the place that they live, and used the military, correct, as an example.
Yeah, I followed back up with both Mr. Whitaker and spoke to him by phone the morning after the debate, and I got an emailed response from Mr. Hobbs, and I'll read this quote in the email. He said, "I will not disenfranchise new Washingtonians, and I will not disenfranchise military personnel and their families like mine, who during parts of their service move frequently." Basically making the argument that just because I, moved from Tukwila to Tacoma last week because I had to for my job, my military position, doesn't mean I shouldn't get to vote in that local, not just the federal, but in those local elections. So that was the end of that argument. But it got all the more interesting in the discussion about logically AI. And
that's correct. Yeah. Another story that TJ was one of the first, along with Mr. Rance in Seattle, to break that story. And it's I have to say, when it was initially pitched to us from TJ, it was scary in terms of what Hobbs's office was doing, using AI to aggregate and create messaging in terms of monitoring social media and headlines and local media responses.
Yeah, and Dale Whitaker brought that up, and the bigger issue behind it, I mean, it's bad enough for folks who, are advocates of privacy and don't want our social media being scoured just because I'm a, pro-Biden or pro-Trump, or say something that could be, skewed as potentially threatening election integrity or whatever. But Whitaker brought it up, the fact that what Hobbs did was bypass the whole bidding process. He went to South Puget Sound College when he decided he wanted to do this logically AI thing. He went to them and he gave them 15% of a contract to award to who they chose, but they already knew it was going to be logically AI. Apparently he's got some connections to some of those folks. And they've been scouring the internet and compiling data on citizens and sending Hobbs these reports bi-weekly. And there have been state legislators, not just private citizens, state legislators, everyday Americans who are on the rolls now as, look out, flag this guy. He might be saying some things on social media that we got to keep a good lookout for. And it's still going on. It's happening today.
Yeah, and one of the things that came up, I mean, there was another AI report that came out that we did get a hold of via Freedom of Information Act request from Secretary Hobbs, had one of our stories on it with an AI created summation saying at the end that this should be looked after because this could create a public response wanting more election integrity. Wow, how scary is that? God forbid. Right?
That does seem laughable. It is scary though to think any Joe citizen, whatever I'm publishing on my Facebook page or whatever, or responding to somebody else's post, that gets me flagged, and that our Secretary of State is using taxpayer dollars to keep a close eye on me. I think there's a lot of people, no matter where your party alliances are, that are concerned about that. But Hobbs defended it. He says we have to expose these false narratives. He says if people are making these posts and I see the false narratives that's trending, I'm going to call it out. And he says, it's more important than ever. He kept bringing up Russia and other influences, but that's not really. And to
Hobbs' credit on this, I mean, I do see a taxpayer interest in it, because with AI, the technological advances would allow you to do something that, in turn, if you were going to go the way of the wagon wheel and have a whole room of fact checkers and such, that would create an outsized differentiation in cost for taxpayers of Washington.
Exactly.
So to that end, I do understand that argument, so it does make sense. But I think that Whitaker's biggest gripe with it was the fact that procurement measures were not followed. Taxpayer protections to ensure we're getting the best price for the best product were subverted by this, handing off of the responsibility to this other group that you had mentioned. And so it will be an interesting ongoing as the election rolls on to see what kind of reports and warnings logically AI sends off to Secretary of State Hobbs as the. I
think you're still on the list, Cole. You are on the ballot.
I am probably on several lists of various acronymed agencies across the country, but that's another story. And if I just suddenly don't show up for the podcast one day, you probably have a good idea why. But thank you, Carlene. Pierce County is working on updating its budget. The latest step is to approve a change to the current one, but it appears the county's council members are on a very different page as their executive. Seattle reporter Spencer Polley reported this week on a particularly scathing veto message. What was brought before the county executive, Spencer?
So Pierce County Executive Bruce Dammeier initially announced his 2024 supplemental budget and sent it over to the Pierce County Council. This budget reworks federal dollars, especially American Rescue Plan Act funds that are set to expire at the end of this year so that they are utilized. Now, the main detail of this supplemental budget that had a lot of county council members worked up was Dammeier's proposal moved $2.5 million in dedicated funding to find a homeless stability site. But instead, he moved that to 3 initiatives that center more around long-term housing. Now, this irked a lot of council members, as I've reported earlier in the summer when this was first announced, because this is something that the council members, 4 of them at least, say is necessary to have temporary housing outside of Tacoma, which is Pierce County's biggest city. Instead, as the supplemental budget process went along, council amended that budget move and instead moved that $2.5 million towards 3 temporary tiny home villages. In turn, Dammeier vetoed the bill over what he said, quote, ill-advised spending, as you said earlier.
I like to refer to this as a diplomatic smackdown in terms of his entire veto message was very Minnesota nice, but still, scathing as all get out.
Absolutely.
He definitely made it very clear that they were not listening to what he was interested in and asked for the veto. Now, Spencer, what was the reaction from the majority that sent him this proposal?
So I can turn to what Pierce County Council Chair Ryan Mello said. He suspects that the veto stems from this $2.5 million, as I do. But he said it's ironic because the initial $2.5 million was authorized by Dammeier towards temporary housing. But I do want to say I think it's important to point out that this site hasn't even been located yet. There's no towns outside of Tacoma that really want to have this site.
Yeah, nobody wants it. They don't know where it's going.
No, and this is, like I said, ARPA funding that is set to expire. So what Dammeier is saying is, let's use this for something else. Now, when I talked to Dammeier about this before, he said, we don't need any more what he says tent cities. That's what he refers to these tiny home villages as. And instead, he wants to see more long-term housing for people who are recovering from homelessness. And about 3 county council members side with Dan Meyer. When this budget proposal was passed, it barely passed with 4 votes and 3
It was
no.
a contentious vote, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And
no, and like Spencer, like King County as well, which you've reported on, really deep. In Pierce County, homelessness in terms of how we approach the problem has been, like King County, a sticking point in how do we start? What approach do we make? Is housing first a waste of taxpayer dollars? Is it irresponsible because it seems like there's no accountability and you're not achieving the metrics that getting people off the streets is the overall objective? And it seems like they've had the same disagreements that King County has.
Correct. Yeah. Here we can go to the 4 Pierce County council members who supported these stability sites. They look at what is going on with KCRHA and saying a housing first strategy is what we need to do. We need to get these people off the streets and have a roof over their heads. But Bruce Dameyer, who is a Republican, and 3 other more conservative council members say, well, we need is to more allocate services towards getting these people to stay off the streets, whether if that's, drug treatment, facilities, and any kind of services that help with mental health. This is something that we're starting to see with Seattle per se, where we're starting to not see if maybe the housing strategy is working as well. But in this, it's a little bit different there, I would say, between Pierce County and King County. Yeah.
I mean, and in King County, you've got the city council head. She had been saying, she and a growing chorus of people there, much like Pierce County, have been saying, listen, putting a roof over a junkie's head is not going to mean that once they leave that temporary housing that they will suddenly be a rehabilitated person. They're simply going to go back to the street because the root cause has not been solved.
Right.
And now, in terms of the veto, the majority did send it, but I mean, it's a little bit higher of a threshold, and there are, as you mentioned, conservatives on this board. Is there an override possibility?
I would say no, Cole. There needs to be 2/3 council majority required to override Dan Meyer's veto, but there are no plans to do so, according to what a Pierce County community manager told me. So what's next? Because the supplemental budgets got shot down. So we have ARPA funds that we need to use before the end of the year. Well, Dan Meyer is authorizing the finance department to apply the interest acquired earnings from this ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, to any of the projects at risk of not meeting needs at the end of the year. And so after that, Dan Meyer's proposing his 2025 mid-year budget. We're expected to see that sometime this month, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Use it or lose it with those federal funds. We'll see if that indeed does become the case as the timeline grows near. Thank you, Spencer. Washington State is one of the first to legalize cannabis for recreational use. Meanwhile, the federal government has been slowly creeping over the years towards doing the same, but there's a lot more objectives, and you're facing a much more conservative legislative base. One of the baby steps taken is loosening restrictions on hemp, which is the more benign relative of the infamous wacky tobacco. Editor Brett Davis dove into the topic this week. Brett, describe the new worry that federal lawmakers have expressed.
So federal lawmakers are worried about hemp-derived products getting into the hands of minors, that is, those under the age of 21. Hemp-derived products include things like CBD oil, edibles, vapes, and even certain food and beverage products. So
now, I'm going to say, go ahead, but are these, to make clear, these products are currently on shelves before you continue on with what they had said about this, right? Just to preface it, to make sure this isn't just some invisible boogeyman argument.
We'll get into that more in a bit here, but last week, didn't mean to cut you off there.
I just wanted to make clear that these are legitimate arguments.
Right. So last week, U.S. Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, he introduced a legislation, the Cannabinoid Safety and Regulation Act, that would facilitate the federal government regulating hemp products and keeping them out of the hands of Americans under the age of 21.
And like we had alluded to before, I so kindly interrupted you mid-groove there. these products, these hemp-derived products that do inebriate somebody, are currently on shelves in Washington state.
That's right. And that's because Congress legalized hemp and hemp-derived products containing less than 0.3% of THC when it approved the 2018 Farm Bill. Now, THC is the chemical compound responsible for the high or intoxication you get from marijuana. Yeah. So at the time, Congress, they didn't implement any type of regulatory framework for these products. So Congress essentially created a new nationwide trade in intoxicating hemp-derived products. So that's been left to the states to deal with this so far. And
the worry about this now is that, kids are getting a hold of it. Right. I mean, is there anything in place at the state level that says, no, 5-year-old, you cannot hand me money for THC?
So here in the other Washington, for example, last year, the legislature passed Senate Bill 5367, which it redefined cannabis products to include those with any detectable amount of THC. Now, before that, ordinary retailers like convenience stores and online sellers, they could sell these products without a license from the State Liquor and Cannabis Control Board. In other words, they could sell, products that contain 0.3% or less of THC. Now, what's interesting about this is the law went into effect in July of last year, but it's my understanding that there's been no real enforcement. I recently received an email from the Washington Cannabis Business Association that said the state's Liquor and Cannabis Board is set to adopt rules next week regarding SB 5367. So it looks like they're trying to play catch up.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, the thing's in place. I guess we should actually try and enforce the law. Now, in terms of, that's Washington. Right. And the worry is there, and we don't have any empirical evidence saying that, little kids are actually getting, getting high on these very low THC products. But are other states doing something similar? I mean, Colorado, California.
Right. And as you mentioned, officials are worried about minors getting their hands on these products. It seems like federal and state authorities, they've been grappling with how to regulate these products, and they're being innovated faster than lawmakers can respond. So They are dealing with this in other states like California, for example. They just issued an emergency ban on all hemp products with any amount of THC. That was less than 3 weeks prior to Governor Gavin Newsom issuing a temporary ban on those products. So this is an issue that a lot of states are dealing with.
All right. Well, we'll see how states catch up to the worry, and I'd be curious to see if we do have any instances of the boogeyman actually becoming a real situation where you have minors being able to get their hands on some of these products. Thank you, Brett, and a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories today. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.